Welcome to Bombs Away, a Minnesota Twins podcast. This is an emergency podcast, but I would have done a podcast today anyways, but the topic is an emergency, and that is that the Minnesota Twins have traded Luis Arraez to the Miami Marlins in a move that feels like it's been telegraphed all season long, but one that you didn't quite know if it was actually coming or if it's one of those that you just kind of talk yourselves into, like a Max Kepler to the Yankees trade, although that could still happen. But one of those where you never really thought it could happen, you didn't really want to happen, and now it did happen. So talk about a Friday news dump. I think that's the biggest thing. News, when if you want a bad story to come out, you kind of put it off like when everybody's getting off work on a Friday, so like nobody really notices it, and by the time Monday rolls around, there's a fresh news cycle and all that. It's kind of how it feels a little bit, but that's how it's been for the Minnesota Twins. They just traded Luis Arraez to the Miami Marlins in a move that broke, I'd say, about 2 p.m. With another Jeff Passan bomb, and I'm going to Jeff Passan's Twitter to officially confirm his tweet that happened at 1:48, so like about 2 o'clock Central Time. Jeff Passan, Twitter bio, ESPN, period. I bomb atomically. And there was another Passan bomb today with the news that, and this is Jeff Passan's words via Twitter, trade news. All-star second baseman Luis Arraez is going to the Miami Marlins, and right-hander Pablo Lopez is headed to the Minnesota Twins, sources tell ESPN. Deal is done, players are being informed, and more to come. And I think really what this tweet is, and we have the full breakdown here from the Minnesota Twins themselves on the trade and who's all going where. In this trade, Luis Arraez is the only person the Twins are giving up. He's going to Miami. The Twins get a starting pitcher in Pablo Lopez. They also get a 17-year-old prospect, which is kind of fascinating because he's born in 2005 in May of 2005, which is just shocking to see that there's a professional baseball player that young, or at least born in that year, playing. But he's one of the guys moved. So a guy who played rookie ball last year, obviously not going to, it's going to be 5 or 6 years before we really ever hear about him getting to Target Field. So he's going to be in the minors a while, a long-term prospect. But this is really, I think, the one that moved the needle for the Twins, because there have been reports during this entire process the Twins wanted Pablo Lopez. Luis Arraez was on the table, but they weren't willing to do a 1-for-1 in Arraez for Lopez. They knew that that wasn't going to be enough. And we'll get to talking about Lopez and the pitcher he is and what he brings to the table in a second. But Lopez is good. He's not good enough to warrant a 1-for-1 trade for Luis Arraez. So they get Jose Salas, the infield prospect, and now he's 19 years old. So again, it's going to be a few more years before we really can get too excited about this prospect. But here's the reason why you can get excited about him in the short term, is that he's Miami's number 4, number 5 rated prospect, depending on where you go. But the point is, he's a top 5 prospect in the Marlins system. And for the Twins to get a starting pitcher in Pablo Lopez, a top 5 prospect, and whoever you want to, whatever, like a throw-in player, that's 17-year-old. That's a good haul. I don't like trading Luis Arraez. I think that should be stated. Luis Arraez is a good ball player. He's the batting champion. I know he only hit, 313? It's got to be impressively low for a batting champ. But still, if you imagine Arraez, who was hurt at the end of last year, if you imagine although he did play in 144 games, but wasn't healthy for all of those, and especially towards the end when his average started to dip. But, by the All-Star break, it felt like this could be a guy who could hit 340 in a season, and just really took a step down in that second half. I'm going to guess it's a lot of injury concerns, but still had that drop in production. And as we'll get to, a guy in Lopez is a guy who kind of had a wonky second half of 2022 as well. So let's look here at this trade now. Let's look at it from this perspective. And this is, I think, the biggest one, because you'll see people on social media immediately who said this is fireable for the Twins. You cannot trade the batting champion. You cannot trade a guy who prioritizes putting the ball in play, a guy who's a throwback player, a guy who's a nice foil to the Twins lineup that likes to do a lot of big swing and miss. Arraez is just a nice kind of diversifier to your lineup in terms of hitting styles, and every lineup needs that. And oh my gosh, how could you trade him? He's a good player. He's likable. He takes good at bats. He does all this stuff. How could you trade him? This is a fireable offense for Falvey. And then you have people who say, look, man, Arraez is a singles hitter. You know, he had his career best year. There's a whole bunch of injury concerns with Arraez. And like, do you want to take that risk? Is there, I mean, like, is it worth it? You're getting a good starting pitcher, whatever. I think I'm somewhere in the middle on this trade. I think at face value, I like the trade because I like Pablo Lopez. I like the trade because of the haul the Twins got in a top 5 prospect. Now, I mean, they traded a top 5 prospect for Sonny Gray last year, who was 19-year-old Chase Petty, and like whatever. It's a teenage prospect. Most teams, unless they're Bryce Harper or Juan Soto, they don't really care too much about teenage prospects because it's such a long time before they get to the major leagues that there's a bit of iffiness there. There's a few more seasons. They could have a huge step down. They could get hurt. Something could go wrong. So that's why a lot of those teenage prospects are good trade bait for teams, as the Twins did last year with Chase Petty for Sonny Gray with the Cincinnati Reds. But I think overall with this Twins trade, I'm somewhere in the middle because I agree. Luis Arraez is a throwback player. He's a guy who like you could pluck and put him onto the 2008 Twins roster and he would just be the best. I mean, not the best player on the team because there's Mauer, but like, and Morneau, but you know what I mean? Like he's just a guy who fits perfectly in that early 2000s Twins of the Metrodome. And there's a bunch of guys who like to slap the ball around the yard and they're scrappy at the plate and they like to bunt and they like to do all the little things and whatnot. And true. And I love Arraez for that because he is a throwback player. He's a guy, I mean, that 13 pitch at bat he had against Edwin Diaz in 2019 to draw a walk. I mean, after being down 0-2, one of the most impressive at bats I've ever seen in my life. And one of the most entertaining walks I've ever seen in my life. That at bat didn't end with him ripping a double. It didn't end with him getting a go-ahead RBI single. It didn't end with him hitting a home run. It just ended with him drawing a walk. And he made walks exciting. He made being at the plate exciting because of his head nods and how charismatic he was. He was a very likable guy in the clubhouse. He's a very likable guy in the media. How could you not like Luis Arraez personally and professionally? I understand that. And it stings losing Arraez. I'll be honest. I wrote a piece for Zone Coverage about this. It's why it took me a little bit to get to get on here and do a podcast, but it's because I was already writing out my thoughts on this Luis Arraez thing because my instant gut reaction was, man, this stings, but I get it. And the Twins are getting a nice value back for him. And that's where I stand. And I just had a little bit of time to kind of look into this and kind of figure this stuff out. And I think that's where I stand on this. So let's take a look at Luis Arraez and just who he's been in his career. If you look at the stat line for Luis Arraez, and I'm pulling this up here, is that over his career, Luis Arraez is a career, his slash line is 314, 374, 410. So his career OPS doesn't crack 800. And I know there's a lot of people out there who love the batting average. And I'm not as high on the batting average as everyone else, as maybe, the more traditional fan. I'm not low on it, like maybe some of the more analytically minded, but like I get why it's overvalued and I get why sometimes it's undervalued in certain situations. But like the career at batting average is fine. That's okay. But when you add it with the on base plus slugging, he's just a guy that he gets on base, but there's singles. Now there's the different, I mean, it's the classic Moneyball line. He gets on base. Do I care if it's a walk or a hit? All that stuff. But still, with that, I mean, he doesn't pick up extra bases is kind of the thing. And that's why the OPS is so low because it's on base plus slugging. So the on base is really high, but the slugging just isn't that low or just as low because he doesn't hit that many home runs and he doesn't hit that many doubles. Now, again, I'm fine with that for Luis Arraez because he's a good foil to the Twins lineup. He's a guy they had the Bomba squad in 2019 where they broke the home run record and Luis Arraez was putting along, having good at-bats, singles, doing everything he needs to do, working the count, making the pitchers throw extra pitches, making them earn it, all that good stuff. So I think this just goes down to a gut level of I understand why Twins fans are upset about losing Arraez, and I'm upset too. to see Arraez leave. But I think when you look at this trade for the Twins, it's justifiable because Arraez is a guy who is a positionless player. Luis Arraez is somebody who didn't stick at first base because Jorge Polanco, or second base rather, because Jorge Polanco moved over from short to second base. That's the right move. Jorge Polanco needs a forever position home, and second base is that home. So Luis Arraez was going to be a third baseman, maybe a utility outfielder, one of those kind of guys. Third base, he's a little bit iffy. The corner outfields, I mean, he just can't cover that much ground. And then you look at first base, which is what he played 65 games in 2022, and he played fine there. But when you look at Luis Arraez, it's not just that he's not a great fielder. He's not a good fielder. In fact, he's a below average fielder when you look at his numbers. So outs above average is just a classic classic stat to use to rank fielders. And in terms of outs above average, Luis Arraez is negative as a corner outfielder. He's negative as a second baseman, negative as a shortstop in his career. He's been negative at all of these positions. First base is the only one where he's got a positive, but it's one. It's one out above average. So he's just above average as a first baseman. And I know you don't quite look at positions like you do in the old days. Like, you know, I mean, heck, people got mad at Joe Mauer because he was a first baseman that couldn't hit for power. And then now Luis Arraez is a first baseman who can't hit for power and, you know, whatever. Now, does your first baseman have to be your slugger? No, but the Twins have a logjam of players. Jose Miranda's the starting third baseman, so Arraez isn't going to get a ton of time there. Jorge Polanco's the starting second baseman. Carlos Correa being back in the fold changes things dramatically because now Kyle Farmer is a utility infielder for the Twins. So he can be the guy to back up Jose Miranda. He can be the guy to back up Jorge Polanco. He can be the guy to relieve some of those corner outfielders. Heck, he could even, he could even replace Buxton center, but I think that's more for Joey Gallo, but I digress. First base is where Arraez would have slotted in. He would have been a first base / DH. And first base is probably reserved now, especially that Arraez has gone for Alex Kirilloff to go. Because here's the thing. I know we haven't seen a ton of Alex Kirilloff, but when that wrist is healthy, I've seen him hit on TV. And I've heard people who have wrote for the Twins, people who have stayed in touch with a lot of Twins guys. And let me tell you, they all love the swing of Kirilloff. They think Kirilloff is such a good hitter. And if he fixes that wrist issue, he's going to be a really, really, really good hitter. So the Twins are like, we're losing a nice contact hitter in Luis Arraez, one of the better contact hitters in baseball. But if Alex Kirilloff is the player that he was hyped up to be because he was the Twins' top prospect for a long time, or at least one or two with Royce Lewis, I mean, you have to give him a shot. He's not a prospect that hasn't gotten to the majors and needs to quote unquote earn it. He's been in the major leagues before in 2021 and 2022. And of course, with the Twins in the playoffs in 2020, because the Twins thought that highly of Kirilloff. So Alex Kirilloff is a guy that when the wrist is good, can be a very dynamic hitter, like a game-changing hitter. I think it was Patrick Royce said it on a Score North podcast. Could be one of the Twins, could be the Twins' best pure hitter this year. And I tend to believe those people because I've heard it from more than one person who's close to the Twins by listening to podcasts and reading the tea leaves on Twitter and all that kind of stuff. That's where I got it. So, like, you got to put Kirilloff at first base. He's a more natural first baseman because it alleviates a little bit of the logjam that you have in those corner outfield positions at left field and right field. Because right now, and Max Kepler could still be traded, but Max Kepler is still on the Twins roster. I know there's a lot of Twins fans saying, well, hey, why did the Twins trade Arraez? Why couldn't they have traded Kepler? I'm sure they tried, but Max Kepler just was not going to fetch Pablo Lopez without the Twins having to give up more. And if you're the Twins, your farm system has already taken a bit of a hit because guys like Kirilloff and Larnach have graduated the prospect program. And now you kind of have to turn it over, and the Twins are trying to reshuffle the farm system. So the prospect, and they drained a little bit of it trying to trade for Tyler Mahle and Michael Fulmer and Sandy Leon and all those guys at the Lopez and those guys at the trade deadline last year. So they didn't have a ton to choose from in the prospect pool, which is why they had to trade Arraez. I'm sure, I mean, they didn't really want to trade Arraez. It would have had to have been a player like Pablo Lopez, and we'll get to Lopez and what he brings to the Twins. But I think first we have to establish it of trying to soft land kind of the sheer emotion of Luis Arraez leaving. Because look, it's going to be hard to see Luis Arraez in a Marlins uniform. He'll look great in it. It's going to be hard to imagine him in that because I really wanted him to be a Twin for a long time, but that's not how it worked out. But I think the Twins got a good deal in this one. It's like parting with a car that you really wanted to, like, you really like the car, you didn't want to get rid of it. We were talking about it, but you had thoughts of driving that car for a few more years and kind of riding with it and seeing what happened. But then somebody just gives you an offer that you feel like you can't refuse. It's not blowing you out of the water by any stretch, but it's a nice offer. Let's say you have a car that's worth $15,000 and whatever. A guy offers you maybe your car's worth $15,000 on the market to sell, and a guy offers you $20,000. You're like, well, this is a nice offer. It's not blowing. He's not offering $30,000 for it, but $20,000 for a $15,000 car. Sure, I'll take that. I get some extra value. I didn't want to part with this car, but now I have $20,000 and I can now use that as I please. And that's what the Twins are doing with this trade in Arraez. They didn't really want to trade him, but it's the price of doing business. Because Twins fans, because the Twins fans don't make buying trades, rarely ever, where they have to give up a major prospect. But that's the price of doing business, is you got to give up some good capital to get good capital in return. The Twins had a surplus of hitters, and they turned that surplus of hitters into now a surplus of pitching. And they still have a surplus of hitters that they can draw from, like Max Kepler. So that's where that stands. Anyway, there's that logjam of corner hitting outfielders. You have Matt Wallner, you have Joey Gallo, you have Trevor Larnach, you have Alex Kirilloff. Moving Alex Kirilloff to first base takes one guy out of the equation. I'm assuming Max Kepler is traded, but until it actually happens, assume he's on the opening day roster. So Max Kepler in right field, Joey Gallo in left, I'd assume, and then Byron Buxton in center, or maybe Trevor Larnach in left, and then Joey Gallo's your DH. Joey Gallo being a DH I wouldn't hate, and then splitting time in center with Buxton, while Buxton will DH from time to time. That is a role I can get behind. It's better than having Max Kepler in center field or Nick Gordon. So that would help the Twins because of Gallo's arm and just what he brings to the table. It's not an ideal fit, but it's a little bit better. And then you still have a guy like Matt Wallner, who's going to cook in AAA, and he's a quadruple A player right now. He's too good for AAA, but we don't quite know if he's a major league player or not. Now, the Twins obviously have to hold on to him in case the trade deadline comes around and they need some prospects to deal, or maybe Trevor Larnach falls off and then Matt Wallner can come up. Point is, the Twins have a lot of depth right now. They have a lot of quadruple A players, and they kind of need to figure out who's a major league player and who's not. It's why, even though Gio Urshela would be nice on this team, you kind of had to, I get Kyle Farmer's here, but Gio Urshela was a starter last year. Kyle Farmer coming in and knowing that his role is a utility guy coming in because Miranda's the third baseman and Carlos Correa's at short and Polanco's at second kind of makes it a little bit easier. So I think the way that this Twins team is structured, they're kind of like, look, this is the push. These are the prospects that Falvey and Levine have developed. Jose Miranda, Alex Kirilloff. Those guys, I think, were brought in under the Terry Ryan regime, but were developed by Falvey and Levine. Like, they spent a majority of their time in the minors when Falvey and Levine were in charge and had their direction and had whatever. So they're pretty much Falvey and Levine. Then Royce Lewis, of course, their first overall draft pick, and then Brooks Lee, and then you have Duran, who they traded for, and you have Larnach, who they drafted. And there's just guys that the Twins have brought up and developed all over this team. And they're like, look, it's their time. They've cooked in the minors for a few years, and it's time for them to see if they're good or not. And if they are good, well, the Twins are going to be very competitive for the next few years. And if they're bad, well, they're kind of out of luck. But they need to know that. They need to know where they stand. Guys like Arraez are good players. They're starting caliber players. But at a certain point, you have guys with higher ceilings who you need to figure out if they're good or not. Kirilloff and Larnach and Wallner and all those guys are in their mid to late 20s. You can't let them cook for much longer. I'm saying cook a lot, but you can't let them just be developmental guys, or you can't let them mix in with the other guys or have to earn their way through AAA. I get injuries have played a part in that. That's also been true, but that's where the Twins are at right now in terms of that. All this gets to say, I think it boils down to with Luis Arraez, he's a player without a position. He's a guy who gets a lot of singles, but doesn't quite get a lot of doubles. And that's not a knock, but that's just where he stands. You know, he's a guy who doesn't get a lot of power. He's a nice foil for the Twins lineup with his pure contact, and I love his at-bats, and I love everything he does. But there are guys on this team like Alex Kirilloff, whose ceiling is higher than Luis Arraez. There's Jose Miranda, whose ceiling is higher than Luis Arraez. There's Trevor Larnach, whose ceiling is higher than Luis Arraez. There's guys on this team who the Twins need to figure out are good or not, and Luis Arraez just kind of adds to the logjam. So the Twins need to use their surplus value to go get value in another spot. And this is what brings us to now Pablo Lopez. So Pablo Lopez comes in this deal to the Minnesota Twins. We've talked about Pablo Lopez before, I believe just on last week's podcast. We talked about Pablo Lopez. We talked about Trevor Rogers. I think we even talked about Edwin Cabrera being in that mix as well. I don't think we really delved outside the Marlins organization because the Twins have had multiple talks with them, and it just seems like a logical fit. Like the Twins and the Padres were talked about a week before the Twins sent Taylor Rogers for Taylor Rogers. So, and this gets me to my next point. Now, Luis Arraez is under team control until 2026, so it's not quite the same thing as Taylor Rogers, being traded from the Twins to San Diego a day before opening day. Now, that one shocked me, and that one, honestly, I feel weirdly more upset about the Rogers trade than the Arraez trade, and I don't know why. I think my only rationale is that the Twins did it in a position of weakness, like the bullpen we didn't think was going to be that strong, and it didn't end up being that strong outside of Duran and Thielbar and Jax. But like Rogers would have been useful, and Emilio Pagan wasn't, and Chris Paddock hurt his elbow, not his shoulder, his elbow. And it happened a day before opening day. Like, this is the crew you're rolling with. They're on their way back up to Target Field right now to start the season. Is this really how you want to do it? I thought that, and the suddenness, I get the lockout played a hand in that, so I understand. But I think that's what did it, and the fact of that there was a position that needed depth way more than the Twins need good left-handed hitters. The Twins have left-handed hitters. That they have a surplus of that. They have a surplus of hitting. Arraez is a guy without a position and a role on this team outside of being a DH/first baseman, which he would have been a part-time player at each. So he's a guy who doesn't have a long-term home. And he's a guy you need to trade surplus value for. And the Twins did that with Rogers because Rogers was going to leave in free agency. And by that, the Twins weren't going to re-sign him. So the Twins are going to try and get some value out of that. And that's how the Twins operate. You look at a team like the Tampa Bay Rays. It's why they move off of David Price early. It's why they moved off of Blake Snell early. It's probably why they'll move off of Tyler Glasnow early. They move off of some prospects pretty early because they realize that, like, this guy's going to be expensive and we're not going to be able to afford him. So let's get rid of him now while his value is high. They traded Blake Snell after nearly pitching the Rays to a World Series win in 2020. And the same thing with Luis Arraez. He, by the way, this is an interesting fact. Luis Arraez is the first player to win a batting title and be traded since when? Rod Carew in 1978. Also for the Twins. I believe that was when it was the Twins to the Angels. So it's kind of fitting that the Twins were involved in both. That was done for two different reasons, but it doesn't matter. That's just how that stands with the Twins. I think it's a fun fact that the only two times that the batting champ has been traded after the season after winning is by the Minnesota Twins. So I think in all of this, it's just to say, with how the Twins do trades, this is kind of how it works. If it's a guy that they're not sure that they're going to be able to lock up long-term, they're not afraid to trade him. Now, Carlos Correa was an exception because he's a superstar and you were trying to lock him up and whatever. You just weren't going to trade him at the deadline. That just wasn't going to happen. But they'll do it with a Taylor Rogers. They'll do it with a Luis Arraez. Luis Arraez is under team control until 2026, but that's also what made him more appealing to other teams, is that Miami could get him on the cheap for the next few years. So they're going to get him for 2023, 2024, and 2025. The Twins are going to get Pablo Lopez through 2023 and 2024. So you get him for the next 2 seasons, which is a very nice bonus. So that's just kind of how the Twins do trades. If there's a guy they feel like they can get some value for, they're going to do it. Because, by the way, that's how they kind of have to. They're a mid-market team, and they're not going to, as much as I wish the Twins would, they're not going to use more financial assets than to be about middle of the pack, like 15th in spending, like literally middle of the pack. So that's not going to happen that way with spending. So they're gonna, that's how you hear Falvey all the time. We got to get creative. And this is how they get creative. I mean, I don't know if Chris Paddock's going to work or not. We'll see how he recovers from the Tommy John. He's probably not going to be back till like August at best. And who knows what the Twins rotation looks like at that time with all the young guys they have. But in terms of major league ready, proven talent, this is a very good Minnesota Twins rotation. It's not great. It's not elite. Like there's the elite tier, there's the really good tier, or like there's the elite tier, there's the great tier, and there's a good tier. And the Twins are in the good and are kind of in that middle, very good. They're good for now. They're good. They're respectable. They're good. It's a playoff caliber rotation. Whether it's a World Series caliber rotation, that's yet to be seen. The Twins don't have a true ace in their rotation. Pablo Lopez is a good get, but he's not an ace. He lines up in quality, and we'll get to Lopez's stats and who he is in a second, but he doesn't quite equate to being an ace caliber pitcher. I think he's got the ceiling to do it, but he might be that Jose Barrios level of really good, but can't quite crack that level. And again, Jose Barrios, another example of a guy the Twins didn't want to extend or didn't think they could extend and said, you know what, we need to get rid of this guy now while we have some value. And it got them Simeon Woods Richardson, a guy who they will use this year at Target Field, and also Austin Martin, who gives the Twins, again, more position player flexibility in the prospect pool if they have to make a trade. I'm not saying I like it all the time. There are some tough trades that they have to make, but this is how they're going to have to reshuffle the farm system and make sure they keep getting good players in here. For the future of the Twins farm system, they have, in the return, a number 5 prospect from Miami. And then they have another 17-year-old to throw in the mix. That's just an add-in. But they now have a guy who will slot in the top 10 in their farm system. Even if he just plays 3/4 of the season for the Twins in Double-A ball or in Low-A ball Fort Myers and gets traded for another player down the road, maybe a nice right-handed hitting bat who can play corner outfield, or maybe it's a good bullpen arm or whoever, you now have trade chips. They're not top-level farm system, but it gets them maybe from 23rd overall to like 17th, and that'd be a big bump. And then you can clear it again, and then you'll have to make a couple trades, but then you'll make it work, and you'll do all this kind of stuff to reshuffle the farm system, because also the Twins have the number 5 overall pick in the draft this year, something that they weren't supposed to get, but because of the draft lottery, they got a very nice slot. So they're going to have the chance to draft another top prospect like they did with Brooks Lee last year. So the Twins are in an advantageous spot to try and reshuffle the prospects and reshuffle the farm system. So that's very good for them. Anyway, so my last point, let's get on Pablo Lopez and how good this guy can be for the Minnesota Twins. Pablo Lopez, over his career, has an ERA of 3.94. So it's an ERA under 4, and you might say, well, that's not good. But when you consider his first couple of years of getting his feet wet, in 2020, 2021, and 2022, he had ERAs of 3.61, 3.07, and 3.75, respectively. His FIP has been under 4 all the last 3 seasons. Fielding independent pitching is that. It basically factors out a few things. It kind of tells you, like, are you pitching above your weight or not? Like, are you overperforming or are you underperforming? Like, how should you have done? It's kind of a barometer for that. And he's kind of been right along with those projections. When you look at his repertoire of pitches, he throws 5 pitches, pretty much relies on the fastball and the changeup. Now, his changeup is really good. From what I've read about Pablo Lopez, his changeup is his not his most used pitch, but his most maybe effective pitch, his best pitch, one of the best changeups in baseball. He has a fastball. He tops it at mid-90s. He's not a guy that's going to throw heat with the fastball, but is a guy that can be effective with it and paint the corners. He can locate it pretty well, and he can locate the changeup pretty well. So that helps, as evidenced by, as we take a look at some of his other stats here, as they're pulling up on the sheet, as evidenced by his as evidenced by the number of walks that he gives up. His walk rate per 9 is 2.65, not terrible. Strikeouts per 9, 8.7. So again, not a ginormous strikeout hitter or strikeout pitcher, but knows how to get guys out. Got the 5-pitch repertoire. He's got the sinker, the cutter, curveball. He mixes in there more than the sinker and the cutter, but overall, it's the fastball and the changeup of which he throws really well. So Pablo Lopez is a guy we talked a lot about last week, so go look at that as well. To Lopez, again, he's a guy who slots in like Tyler Mahle. He's a good number 2. If he goes to the Pittsburgh Pirates, Lopez or Mahle, they're number 1 pitchers for that team. If you go to the Dodgers, you're like a 4 pitcher or a 3 pitcher. If you go to the Twins, you're a number 2. And so the Twins have loaded their rotation with a lot of number 2 pitchers. Joe Ryan isn't an ace, like a bona fide Max Scherzer, Justin Verlander, Jacob deGrom kind of ace. But he's a nice pitcher and a guy who's got a lot of upside. So you have Joe Ryan. You have Tyler Mahle, again, in that same boat. Not an ace, but a nice number 2 pitcher. You have Pablo Lopez. Not an ace, but a nice number 2 pitcher, number 3, that middle to top of the rotation kind of arm. Then you also have Sonny Gray, who's, again, on the Reds is like your number 2 starter, but now on the Twins, for the Twins being like their number 4 starter means they have a really good rotation. And that number 5 spot, the Twins seem to hint that it's going to be Kenta Maeda. Again, another nice little feather in the cap, another nice piece that they can use to try and add to this pitching staff. And that's not even counting guys like Louis Varland. That's not counting guys like Bailey Ober, who might start the season in AAA. Maybe that's the best for him considering his injury-laden 2022, get healthy, get his confidence back, whatever. You have Simeon Woods Richardson. You have Josh Winder. You have just this plethora. You have Jordan Balazovic, if he can turn it around. The Twins have this plethora of starting pitchers that they can draw from to kind of create this lineup of this rotation of like a report card. Some teams, they have an A as their ace, and then it goes down to like 2 Bs, and then a C-, and then a D or an F or something. Your number 5 guy's just a wash. The Twins have like B, 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 B-, C+, if you like Kenta Maeda, because you're not sure how he's going to do a year and a half removed from Tommy John surgery. Whatever. That's a good lineup. That's a really good starting rotation. Not great, not elite, but really good. And has the potential to be really good. This is a rotation that can get the Twins to the playoffs. And if Pablo Lopez or Tyler Mahle or Joe Ryan reaches that upside or takes another step, if Joe Ryan can take another step and maybe pitch a few more innings. Pablo Lopez pitched 180 innings last year for the Marlins. That's a lot of innings. Now, in the second half of the season, I think he had, by the All-Star break, had an ERA of under 3, and it went up a whole run to end the season. So he definitely fell off in the second half of the season. His ERA went up to over 4, and it evened out. So he had a really great first half, a not so great second half of the season. But I think overall, he's still a good pitcher, and he's still somebody that the Twins can roll with. The concern would be, he threw 180 innings. Are the Twins going to go 5 and dive? And I think if the Twins rotation is built as it is, I don't see a reason to go 5 and dive, because now you've added more quality. Maybe you do with Kenta Maeda. Maybe you pair him with Bailey Ober or Josh Winder or Cole Sands or somebody. Maybe when Chris Paddock comes in, who knows? But I think this allows the Twins to be able to be more flexible with their starting rotation, getting an innings eater guy like Pablo Lopez. And the last thing I'm going to look up here is the innings for Pablo Lopez. So in 2020, he pitched a total of 57 innings. Of course, that was in the COVID shortened year. In 2021, he had 102 innings. In 2019, he had 111. So 180 is a bit of an outlier. So it's very unlikely you're going to get 180 innings out of him, even if the Twins don't do the 5 and dive all season long. Maybe it gets closer to 130, 150. That's still a nice number. especially considering he hasn't gotten anywhere close to that high at all in his career. So you just want to make sure that you don't overuse that arm, especially early in the season. But he's a guy that you can trust to pitch deep into ball games and to get a lot of innings. That also might be because his manager was Don Mattingly, and a very old school manager for Miami last year. So that might have also played a bit of a hand in that. But that's where the Twins stand. I think in terms of Pablo Lopez, I think he's a really good get for the Twins. I've talked about him on the podcast before. Go back and listen to last week's episode on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. And then I also talked about him back when we did a trade deadline preview on the Bombs Away podcast back in late July. And I said, Pablo Lopez is a guy to watch out for. He's a sneaky addition that I think would be really good on this team. Now, I was very high in him back then. I've softened a little bit with that fall he had at the end of last season and his ERA going up, but still a good pitcher, still somebody the Twins are good to get. And I think that's the value. The Twins got a good value for Arraez. It sucks to lose him, but I get it. I get the value. Time will tell. Maybe the Twins end up regretting this trade. Maybe Lopez is shot. I don't know. But as of right now, the Twins got better in the starting pitching department. Twins fans were clamoring, well, we got Carlos Correa, but do we get any pitching? Well, they were never going to get Verlander or DeGrom. They were never going to get those guys. They were never going to get Carlos Rodon without massively overpaying, in which case Twins fans would have complained that he was being overpaid. So it's a bit of a lose-lose with that if you're looking at it from that angle. But look, the Twins got pitching, and to get major league caliber pitching, he's a veteran. He's pitched 4 years in the league. He knows to go about his business. He's still 26 years old, has some upside, has another year of team control after this one because Sonny Gray, Tyler Mahle, Kenta Maeda all scheduled to be free agents after this season. So it protects you in case all three of those guys leave to at least where now you could have Joe Ryan and Chris Paddock and Jorge Lopez, Pablo Lopez, Jorge Lopez is closer. And those guys kind of protects you at the top of the rotation in case those guys leave. But that's where the Twins stand right now. And that's really all my thoughts on this. I could just kind of delve into the little weeds a little bit, but I think that's pretty much it. I'm going to keep it brief and we'll talk about other things. I've yet to talk about the bullpen yet. This is like the third podcast in a row I've pushed that off because there's been breaking news and we've just had other things come up that I think we want to talk about more. So I promise you for like the third week in a row, we're going to talk about that next week. This has been the Bombs Away podcast. I'm CJ Baumgartner and we'll talk next time.